Gaia Marcus is the director of the Ada Lovelace Institute. Prior to joining Ada, Gaia held senior level civil service roles in data and AI roles in the UK government, as well as serving on government reform and as head of the UK's National Data Strategy, having previously led on digital innovation, network analysis, and data strategy in the charity sector. Gaia, will you join us? Jan Talon is a founding engineer of Skype and Kazaa. He is a co-founder of the Cambridge Center for the Study of Existential Risk and the Future of Life Institute. Jan, will you join us? Dr. Raman Chaudhry is a globally recognized leader in data, science, and responsible AI, uniquely positioned at the intersection of industry, civil society, and government. Please join us up front. Thank you. And finally, we have Stephanie Ifayemi. She is the Senior Managing Director of Public Policy at the Partnership on AI. Previously, Stephanie served as Head of Digital Standards Policy in the UK government, where she built a new portfolio focused on technical standards for emerging technologies, including AI. Come on up and join us. And I am Dr. Christine Custis. I am the Program Manager of Professor Nelson's Science, Technology, and Social Values Lab. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists. They've asked us if we can please stand for a picture before we start. And we also would like one more microphone, please. Okay, thank you so much for joining us again. We're excited to talk here today about this important issue. The first question that we have is for all of our panelists. We framed this panel around a core tension. Governments are both AI regulators and AI users, but you've each approached this question from different angles: policy development, implementation, research, entrepreneurship. So from where you sit, is that the right framing? What's the most important consideration governments miss when they think about deploying AI systems? And I'll just start closest to me, and we'll go down the list.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So think about this question. I think when governments deploy AI systems themselves, I think of them essentially dog-fooding their regulatory system. So governments tend to be held to a higher standard than, say, the private sector, because people don't tend to have the choice to opt in or out of using their services. And people tend to be, at least in the UK, where most of our research is being done, people are very attached to how the state shows up. And so when you have gaps in your regulatory system, you essentially find that those are exacerbated for government. So if there are liability gaps, as we see, if there are gaps of governance, if you're not governing at the foundation model layer, and therefore there are risks that might be pushed downstream, government often suffers from that. And so I think when we think of government as regulator and then government as service provider, there's a real tension there, because they are both. And if the system doesn't work for like SMEs, it's definitely not going to work for government.
Thank you so much. Jan, what do you think about that?
Thank you, and good morning. I do think it kind of like is different for governments that are hosting the companies that are doing the kind of frontier AI development, and countries that are not doing that. And I think for the countries who are hosting, there is like even like a more general and a more intense tension, which is those governments are kind of dependent on the companies increasingly for the competitiveness on both economic, military, etc. On the other hand, they're supposed to kind of regulate and oversee the development. So it's like a really tense situation. One way to kind of like see it without actually, I'm a European, I don't know what exactly is going on in the US, but like you just see the kind of the incoherence of the decisions when it comes to like export controls, for example. Like part of the government wants to kind of limit access of the chips to some other competitive country or competitor countries. On the other hand, they kind of yield to the what it looks like kind of pressure from the companies like NVIDIA to actually not do that. So like they kind of seem to be doing both.
Thank you. I'm American. I don't know what's going on in our country either. So one thing I think about quite a bit, having worked with governments on implementing AI systems, and in particular, I think this is relevant for India and any of the countries building sovereign AI, is there's always insufficient investment on privacy, security, and responsible use. So currently, there's a lot of interest in data centers, owning your own data, collecting your own data, building your own models, et cetera. But I see very little to no conversation about ensuring you have the infrastructure for test and evaluation, responsible use, privacy, and security. One of the most important things, and this is what I work on with Human Intelligence Public Benefit Corporation, is that Gen AI requires a very different type of evaluation that is quite different from machine learning. These are not statistical models. These are probabilistic outputs. We have just scratched the surface, and we don't have exact sciences around how we should be testing and evaluating. So what I would love to see is investment from the government on developing new methodologies and making these methodologies public, so to ensure that not just government models are being built well, but that it sets the tone for how companies are building their models as well.
I think that last point is so important in terms of government as a regulator and user. I think this tension really depends on to what extent government is able to demonstrate best practice on both sides. So I've been in government myself and now in civil society, and I think for me, it really has to be grounded in the principles that government has to be able to deliver AI deployments that are fair, trustworthy, safe, and secure, but also that accountability is at the heart of those deployments too. And so I think for us in the work that we do, if we just take agents as an example, if governments were to deploy agents, how do they do that in a way that is safe, secure, and trustworthy? We released a paper recently on real-time detection and monitoring around agents. And one of the traditional principles in civil service when you're thinking about government deployments is the chain of accountability. So you really need to have a means through which you can document practices. So you need to be able to trace back accountability in the actions that civil servants take. And so as we think about agents, for example, the whole premise around agents is that they are more autonomous and that governments can take a step back. So what does that mean when we think about principles like that chain of accountability, where you're able to kind of demonstrate step-by-step processes that can ensure that governments and their actors are held accountable? And so that begs the question as to what extent agents contradict with some of the traditional principles that we've thought about when it comes to governance by governments. And so I think there are just some fundamental questions. How do governments resolve those types of questions? How do they have good monitoring infrastructure? How do they have strong documentation practices? And if we're able to get those right, then maybe the tension isn't as prevalent, but it's dependent on those good practices that they can demonstrate. And maybe the last thing I'll quickly say is, I think, building on Ramon's point, that governments have a really strong role in demonstrating best practices, and to what extent can governments also be able to build an ecosystem around assurance that really is able to show that is built on their own best practices around assurance and can demonstrate to industry the practices that they should be adopting too. And so I think there doesn't have to be a tension if government also leans into a kind of testing, evaluation, assurance ecosystem and can ensure that not only themselves, but the practices of the industry are also demonstrating safety, security, et cetera.
Thank you. Good morning. Great to be here with you all. So I'm going to pick a thread, I think, from both Jan and Steph, who queued me up on accountability. I think the tension between government as a user and also as a regulator of AI is depending, particularly if you are a country that has leading labs, exactly as Jan identified, is something akin to a conflict of interest, right? On the one hand, you have all of this sort of financial business scale up, the sort of race that's national competitiveness, that's economic competition, that in some ways mitigates against the kinds of guardrails and responsible kind of infrastructure that we need for AI. So it's a tension that we are certainly dealing with in the United States that I think won't be able to go unresolved for too long, but we'll see. And I guess I'd want to offer a couple of other ways in which it's different. I mean, I think that, citizens are not, one of the things we are as consumers, but in our role as citizens, we should have other expectations for the state and its use of AI. So including that you can have a right to understand how the state is using AI, how decisions are reached rendering that. You might not have that same expectation in the commercial sector, but if a state is using a government, a local government, a state government is using these technologies, there's an expectation that you have a right to sort of understand the work that the government is doing on your behalf in your name. Second, you can't change. You might prefer, Gemini to Claude or to another chatbot. So as a consumer, you can switch between chatbots. As a citizen, you can't really change your state in most instances, right? And so you're really stuck with a state that is using these tools for a certain kind of governance, and the state has kind of sovereign power over the decisions that it's making unless it is willing to participate in some of the democratic accountability and some of the insurance and evaluation that Steph was talking about. And then, last I would say, particularly in the United States, but I think that's true of a lot of other countries as well, we're in an incredibly low trust environment, and I think the use of algorithms and AI and government sort of is only compounding that right now. It doesn't always have to be the case. There are ways to, I think, develop and deploy and use AI in government that offer more transparency, more accountability into how the systems are used. But right now, the risk in a low trust environment of introducing into government tools that are more obscuring of the practices of government is a real risk to democracy. It's a real risk to social cohesion. So if a chatbot or AI system kind of fails in the commercial sphere, and this goes back to something that Gaia was saying, that's a failure mode and it's a problem for your brand. It's a problem in the consumer space. If it fails in the government side, either because autonomous weapons are destroying communities, or people are being wrongly sorted into social welfare benefits, et cetera, being discriminated against, the erosion to democratic societies, the erosion to society is really profound. And so I think that we really need to pay attention to that.
That's amazing. We're going to come back to Alondra in just a moment, but I'd like to ask Gaia a little bit about that. I know that Ada Lovelace has a lot of evidence on government use of AI and governing with AI as part of your, there's a report that you did. One was called Learn Fast and Build Things, and just would love to hear more about the lessons that you learned from those 6 years of studying AI in the public sector, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Thank you. Hi. Yeah, thank you. So we did a really nice summary piece of work called Learn Fast and Build Things, and also looked at public perceptions of government use that looked at 32 reports over 6 years of government AI and data use in the UK. And I think there are just some really important things that we learned from it, and it's been really important to sit with that analysis and think about what is useful for this audience. So our core tenet is, as Alondra was saying, you cannot opt out of using government. Therefore, you are held to a higher standard by the citizenry, and you really learn a lot about what people's true preferences are, rather than what they will accept when it's a private business and they're kind of trading convenience for, say, lack of privacy. So we see a lot of things. The first thing I think we've seen is that at the moment, lack of clear terminology is really messing up our ability to understand what's actually happening with AI use. So something we're seeing in the UK, but I think we're seeing everywhere, is that you see examples of very narrow, specific use cases of AI being used to justify investment in generative AI and used to justify rollout of generative AI, which is not actually having the same effects. And to Roman's point, it's incredibly hard for the government at the moment to really, actually on Stephanie's, to evaluate and understand what's going on the ground. And because of the hope and hype cycles that we're in at the moment, we find that any work to say, hey, slow down, is this use working for you, is often met as doomerism. So we recently published on transcription tools used by social workers, which is a really delicate use case. And we find some really interesting things. Social workers love using these tools, but they do introduce hallucinations. So this is potentially erroneous things going to care records. We have to be able to say, it is right that you want to save time. However, if we do not understand the rate of hallucinations or how you do human in the loop, you're inserting real problems into the use case. And I think what we're really seeing is because people are so attached to AI one way or the other, it's really hard to just steer that steady ship of let's evaluate, let's understand what works, let's understand what works in real life, not just in the lab, and then let's develop typologies and ways of rolling these tools out in such that you're not creating new risks. And that seems like a really hard conversation to have at the moment.
Absolutely, and I wanted to circle back to Alondra because she has some information about the work that she did with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So Alondra, you saw these tensions firsthand. You saw the stakes that were fundamentally different when governments deploy AI versus when companies do, and how commercial failure and, as a business problem is different from government failure, which becomes a democratic accountability problem. So what does that mean for how governments should approach deployment?
Means we need regulation, I think is the long and short of it. But that can look a lot of different ways. I think it can be a commitment to funding evidence-based research about evaluation, transparency, things that help us to know more about the tools, the big computer science problem of explainability and how we're gonna sort of chip away at that problem. It can look like certainly laws, things like the EU AI Act or some of the legislation that's happening in the UK, some of the legislation that's happening in the United States. I live in part in New York City and New York State, where we have an AI safety bill that was passed in the fall, as well as legislation that says you've got to be notified if algorithmic pricing is being done. So there's a kind of suite of regulation, I think, that can be brought to bear. And I think different from our colleagues here in India, if you look at the sort of polling data on how different nation states feel about AI, the United States, the sort of measures are very negative about AI, often 50 to, like in the sort of 50 to 70%, which suggests that these are bipartisan misgivings about AI, not just that sort of one group likes them and one group doesn't. It's a kind of majority of folks who have concerns. And so people are really asking, because of problems with CSAM, with young people's mental health, there's just like a whole suite of kind of daily injuries and risks that are happening, and exist in addition to those that are sort of looming both in the near term and in the distant future. And there's a real desire for that. So I think that governments are going to have to respond. One of the things I worked on, and the Biden administration, is something called the AI Bill of Rights, which was a year of public deliberation that we distilled from academic researchers, from the commercial research community, and from just stakeholders, from just local communities in the United States, principles that they thought should be the sort of high-level principles for the United States as the AI was being built. Very basic things like the system should be safe and effective, kind of at a very basic level. And it's now the case in the United States, if you know the political terrain a little bit, that Ron DeSantis, the Republican governor of Florida, has advanced a Bill of Rights for Florida, right? So just to give you a sense, that takes up some of the principles that were in the policy work that we did in the Biden-Harris administration and expands those further, actually. It's actually quite interesting and good legislation that's being proposed. So I think governments actually need to pay attention to the fact that people are these are becoming very clear political issues. I mean, another way AI is becoming a very clear political issue is around the energy grid, is around data centers. And so there's now, I think, anchors and language for citizens to be able to, I think, make different kinds of claims on government about how they want AI tools and systems to be used. And frankly, saying that we don't want a data center here puts a choke point, and the sort of, in the AI ecosystem in a way that's not inconsequential.
Thank you so much. I'm fascinated by the afterlives of the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights. It's extraordinary. Jan, I'm going to come back to you. Your work at the Future of Life Institute focuses on governing transformative technologies and mitigating catastrophic risks. When you look at governments deploying AI across public services, from benefits administration to medical research to national security, what failure modes concern you most?
Thank you. So the the biggest kind of failure mode actually doesn't happen, in my view, in the application level. The way I look at it, of a like life cycle of AI, of like frontier AIs, I think they're like kind of free frontiers where they're kind of are creating unprecedented situations on this planet. The final of them is deployment. Basically, like once you have AI that deploys and kind of diffuses and basically has like social effects, which is clearly an important frontier. But I think this is like almost all the focus of regulators currently. I think there are two other frontiers. Like first frontier is where the data is being trained, and this training regime these days is called unsupervised learning. Unsupervised learning for a reason. It's not supervised. So like we get like basically these random capabilities, and we kind of rely on lack of capabilities for containment. So that's like it's not going to last forever. The second one I think is the most dangerous frontier. This is the internal deployment. This is where like I call it AI hits the soft tissue, where it kind of gets access to people and can kind of manipulate them and do whatever. And the fact is that actually the most powerful models are no longer published. So they are kind of kept inside the companies. And there's a very pragmatic reason for that. It's just they're too expensive to run. So like they actually get like the most powerful models that are kept inside, and then you can do distillation on that, make it kind of the sort of like well-behaved cheap models that then are published as frontier models. So like in some ways, I think the biggest failure mode really is the lack of awareness what is happening inside the companies. Also, like additional thing to add to it is that the kind of evaluations are now getting saturated. So it's like you have like this regime that has been built on evaluations to kind of create some kind of awareness within the companies and outside, and like these the evaluations just like come back with like 100%. What do you do now?
Right. That's interesting. Definitely. Roman, I want to come back to you. We've talked about how government AI failures become accountability problems. You've been on the ground working on this, coordinating with the Biden administration to bring thousands of people to DEF CON for like a hackathon, to red team AI systems for OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, working with the California government on evaluation frameworks. You weren't just looking for technical bugs. You were testing for bias, manipulation, privacy violations, and other things. From that experience, tell us what you learned about what governments actually need to assess.
Great question, thank you. And there's two studies I'd like to talk about. One was the DEF CON event, where actually we designed the study around the AI Bill of Rights. And the second is actually something called Project ARIA, which was a project of NIST, and it was a red teaming that was actually launched to any citizen in the United States. You could participate in a red teaming evaluation to look at all of these frontier models, and the input would actually help NIST create their standards and their policies. And the difficult task at hand was actually operationalizing these terms. So, Alondra and her team did an amazing job of saying, hey, these are the priorities we should have: privacy, security, data protection, et cetera. Now, it was our job to take that and create something measurable. Now, if we are going to Jan's point, to really try to evolve the process of evaluation, we actually have to evolve the process of measurement. So by background, I'm a quantitative social scientist, and we take terms that are difficult to understand, democracy, social capital, and we put measurements on them. And this is actually one of the biggest things to think about. So, Steph was mentioning things like, manipulation, and Alondra was talking about things like over-reliance, critical thinking, right? And we worry about how young people's brains will be influenced by all of these systems. We worry about how, our livelihoods will be impacted. And these are concepts that need to now be measured and quantified so that we can go ahead and say, how should artificial intelligence be implemented in schools so that young people are not becoming disillusioned by using AI, but instead are using AI to augment their learning? And all of this requires deep scientific intervention. So to what government should be thinking about, how they should be thinking about it, yes, they should think about the hard, safety, security problems, but they also need to think about manipulation, bias, discrimination, as well as now these conversations we're having about parasocial relationships, mental illness, because who else will do it?
Right. Interesting. Like, I'm thinking about how we quantify impact on cognition. That's like an important thing to think about, but something that we need to measure. Stephanie, I'm going to come back to you. There's often a tension in government between the pressure to modernize and appear innovative versus the responsibility to get things right and protect the people's rights. You've seen this up close. Tell us more about the work that the Partnership on AI is doing in this space.
So there are so many examples here, and I think sovereign AI is probably a theme that we'll hear, and we have been hearing throughout the summit. And I know Alondra just mentioned environmental impacts, infrastructure, data centers, and I think there's probably going to be a lot of discussion at the summit in relation to this kind of pressure to modernize, the pressure to kind of have your own kind of sovereign infrastructure, but how do you weigh up the kind of costs, I think geopolitically, in terms of what those dependencies mean in the long term, but also things like environmental impacts. But just because I think that that's going to come up a lot in the summit, I'm actually going to switch gears to something as basic as documentation. I call it basic because I think it's quite foundational, and it's a kind of tool that I think many of us recognize that facilitate all of the things I think Rahman talked about, evals, testing. I think we've all recognized the importance of having that type of assurance infrastructure. About a year and a half ago now, we did a report which was looking at the interoperability of documentation requirements. So we looked at 8 international policy frameworks, and this include the NIST, RMF, and I see Alham here, who was the kind of architect of that in the US government. We looked at the Seoul Frontier Commitment, so the Seoul Summit, we're now at the India Summit, the commitments that came out of that, the EU AI Act. And what we found was there was some consistency in which documents or artifacts that policymakers called out. So technical documentation was something that was called for from companies. Incident reporting was another one, for example. And so if governments, I think there's a shared kind of understanding, G7 Code of Conduct was another one, of some of the artifacts we want. To what extent are governments holding themselves to that same standard that they're calling for? And I think that that's a useful example because it's a clear demonstration of we have public strategies and policy frameworks that governments have drafted themselves, but I think there's still a gap in those kind of basic documentation tools that governments should also be putting out there and utilizing themselves. I think a second example is another kind of basic tool, but I call it basic because these are the kind of foundational tools that we should be leaning on. The second is international law. So we published a paper in, I think, September now, which was looking at how the role of international law in governing AI agents. And there's still so much to be, I think, discovered there. And I think going back to this what is unknown about how governments might think about agents and questions around accountability, we were looking at questions of how agents might operate at the international level when utilized by governments, and responsibilities that governments and states have to each other, including things like transboundary harms. One of those, for example, is non-interference, not getting involved in election interference and manipulation. Rules governing how one state might harm another's critical infrastructure, for example. And so how do we ensure that there are kind of rules and frameworks that govern failures that might happen, depending, of course, on how governments adopt or use agents in the future when it comes to some of those kind of critical questions. But again, that's another example of how do you adapt or think about the role of tools like international law that to date have governed those actions or interactions between states, and how might that need to be readapted in the future. And I think, again, that's just another example where if we just return to the basic kind of legal principles and think about how those apply, we will make a lot of progress. Easier said than done, but again, foundational tools first.
Definitely. A lot of amazing work coming out of Partnership on AI. Thanks so much. So we're going to have a bit of Q&A in just a moment, but first we're going to do he's ready. First we're going to do a lightning round. So this is a question for everyone, 60 seconds. We'll start on this end. The final question. We've talked about accountability, evaluation, capacity gaps, and the unique stakes when governments deploy AI. If you can ensure governments get one thing right over the next 5 years, whether in how they regulate AI or how they use it themselves, what would it be?
You need to have an understanding and a plan for what AI needs to mean for your country and your jurisdiction. So by just using current tools, you are playing into an ideological basis that comes from labs, essentially, in Silicon Valley. You need to have one strategy that says, we think AI will do a thing for us. This is the thing. And we will get to that through our industrial strategy, through how we evaluate, through how we regulate. Because at the moment, we have whack-a-mole. You know, you're hitting different parts of the stack in different ways, and we're just seeing governments respond when the public is sufficiently exercised. That is not a plan, that is a series of actions. We need to know your plan.
Love it, love it. Jan?
Thank you. So, yeah, just to build on my last answer, that also for the countries who are not hosting the leading models, your future also depends on what's happening inside those labs. So, like, putting pressure on the governments that are hosting those, and kind of making sure that they actually understand what is happening in the labs. And in particular, I'm like sickeningly worried about the thing that now labs are explicitly aiming for, which is recursive self-improvement. Making sure that like we can remove humans from the loop of creating further AIs and loss of control that potentially could come out of that.
I would say investment in the community, independent community of practice of algorithmic evaluators. And there's two reasons. There's the ethical, responsible use, public interest reason, and then there's actually a purely capitalistic reason. So the ethical, responsible use reason is that this is how we get people from 70% not liking AI to actually being more trusting of AI systems, because we need to create independent evaluators. And this is not, you know, a crazy thing to say. This concept exists in just about every major industry that is impactful on people, whether you're talking about finance, education, aviation, medicine. There is no industry, in fact, that just lets companies do what they want and build things that are so societally impactful. And the capitalistic reason, frankly, is this is a massive market. You know, there is a lot of ask from not just the frontier. We focus a lot on the frontier labs, but actually most of my work is done with Fortune 100 companies. And you have insurance companies, automotive companies, banks, you name it, any industry trying to adopt AI that has these very, very big questions on independent evaluation, and they have nowhere to go. So investing in that market is also about creating new job opportunities, it's about ensuring responsible use, and it's actually about creating better innovation.
Just gonna plus one that point and build on it actually, which I think it's such an important point around assurance. We're actually releasing a paper on Friday, which is focused on how you build a robust assurance ecosystem. And I think that this is so important because we talk about these principles like justified or calibrated trust, which is that what tools do you really need to calibrate your trust in a system, not just kind of told to have blind faith that it's going to operate in this way and that it's safe and it's secure, but you should have the tools that you need to determine whether you should trust it. So one random example I'm going to use now is that I was ill recently and I got a prescription from the doctors, and I trust the doctor, right? And I get the prescription, but it also came with this document around some of the limitations or potential risks of using this medicine. But then I can then weigh out, like, do I still want to take it? Yeah, I trust the doctor. I am aware of the potential risks. And so how do we ensure we have documentation around limitations that models have? And then, you know, whether you're a citizen, whether you're a government sort of thinking about your own needs, what do you need to calibrate your own trust? And I think that part of that comes from building this, you know, strong assurance ecosystem. And for us, particularly an independent kind of third-party testing ecosystem where we have evals across the value chain. And particularly there, I think Raman made a really important point around the fact that this isn't just thinking about model providers. We should be thinking about deployment across sectors and what is distinctively needed within those sectors too. So I think a lot of progress could be made in that area.
Thank you. Alondra?
Great. Yeah. I guess I would say, so you gave us 5-year window. I'm gonna be aspirational and say something that's gonna sound almost ridiculous, but I want us to kind of move the Overton window, I think, on a couple of things. So one, just on the, like, a phrase like recursive self-improvement, like, is it improving? I don't know. I mean, I guess I want us to, like, I think, be really careful around the language, particularly as, you know, agents are, you know, up and running, you know, locally on our laptops or in between nation states or whatever. And, you know, is recursion always improving? And so I think I want to hold that question open. And I want to, you know, ChatGPT gets introduced November of 2022. We're immediately start talking about the race to the bottom among the AI labs. And I worry very much about a race to the bottom among nation states with regards to AI. I mean, laws that were hard fought, regulations to get on the books are being eroded or being clawed back, et cetera. So the race to the bottom has moved from the private sector to the public sector. I think it's a real concern. And so my aspiration here would be to ask our countries to be the best model of how these tools and systems could be used, not the worst model, right? To sort of have them be Guy is laughing. The sort of, again, aspirational Overton window. Like, imagine that our, nation states could be the best models of how they're used, with the best safeguards, with the most safety. Like, could model to industry, could model to, other nation states how we might do that. So that's my Pollyanna-ish close.
Join me again in thanking our panelists for today. And we'll open it up for some Q&A. Do we have any microphones in the audience?
Thank you. It was an enriching session, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So I'm a researcher from Ashoka University, and we often talk about how extensively government frameworks should be in ethics, but in practice, compliance is often very voluntary or manual, and it is bypassed by enterprise blocks very easily. So in your view, how can we move from governance intent towards system-level, unbypassable constraints that prevent data leakage automatically at the user level, so that it can be done pervasive and on a large scale and with collaboration of all countries?
We're talking about Pollyanna, right? So we are we need to move from a situation where we have voluntary commitments to a situation where we have mandatory standards at the international level that are deployable and enforceable and ratified at the domestic level. It is very hard to know what the path from A to B is at the moment. We have a panel tomorrow at 10:30 in room 4A, if anyone wants to join, where we have 4 or 5 countries talking about the exact question. Like, how can middle countries or otherwise aligned countries come together and ensure that there is an enforcement toolkit that is applied now? And I think without that, we're just going to see regulatory whack-a-mole, forward, back, sideways, responding to domestic pressure. It is very hard to know what the path is, but I think there are many people working on it, so join us.
Maybe
I'd just say transparency and slow down.
Only thing I'd say to echo that is important in order for all governments to be on the same page for alignment. We published a paper last year where we were talking about the AI governance stack and the different tools and mechanisms that we've been using to govern to date. And in 2020, I think we mapped that there are 8 levels in the stack from principles down to enforcement. And by 2025, I think we had 13 levels of that stack. And so we're just adding more layers, and we have the institutes. In July, we'll have the UN Scientific Panel playing another role. The network of institutes has changed its title now to focus on benchmarks and evals. And this progress is good, but we have to kind of check back in. Is it aligned? Are we interoperable? Are we all working towards the same goals? So I think just keeping an eye on that alignment element will be important.
Good morning, everyone. Namaste. My name is Devika Rao. I'm from the United Kingdom. I work with the community cohesion sector, particularly young people and women. And my question to you, how do you see AI co-creating for the quality outcome?
Is the question more like, how are people working with AI to do this?
Collaborating with AI.
I mean, I think that's a very interesting take, and I think one of the predecessors that is necessary is to know that these systems are trustworthy and reliable. I think, Gaia was just using an example of, theoretically, like, social workers want to use Gen AI systems for transcription, and transcription, one would assume, seems to be a very basic use case, and yet there were a lot of questions that would require a human-in-the-loop oversight. So I think one of the precursors to co-creating a better future with AI is, can we ensure that the AI's output is consistent, reliable, and helpful? For that, we will actually have to design mechanisms that will ensure that you have some sort of like a reliability check. In particular, because often when we're talking about designing better futures, we are implying that we want vulnerable communities that are often left out of the conversation, being in that room. And that's one of the most important things. But also, these are the communities that tend to be the least literate as it relates to AI, and also often the ones that are not as comfortable raising their hand when there's a problem. So these are the things that would have to be addressed.
We've just published, and I can follow up afterwards, but we've just published with the Nuffield Foundation a piece of work called Grown Up, which is about the experience of 14 to 24-year-olds growing up with digital technology. So it's not just AI, it's more broadly. And they really need adults to step up, is the thing that we're really hearing. Like, we are letting young people deal with these systems without having proper mechanisms in place, really exposed to like the most gruesome harms on, you know, Reddit and such things. And like, on the other hand, they can't imagine a world where that isn't what's happening for them. And they have really nuanced understandings of what they do and don't want for things like digital technologies and AI. And I think the more we have mechanisms to listen to people and to ensure that our governance and regulation reflects what they want and what they're experiencing, the better. We're really happy to follow up afterwards.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I'm most interested in kind of collective decision-making help from AI. The work of organizations like Collective Intelligence Project I find very interesting.
Merve from Center for AI and Digital Policy. One of our flagship work is looking at the national AI strategies and practices of 80 countries every year. So we want to make sure that we see the gap between commitment and implementation. There's always a gap, obviously. This year we are seeing that gap widening because some countries are focusing more on AI first rather than humans first. So my question, maybe Dr. Nelson and Jan Tallinn, at the international level, we already mentioned like consumers, citizens making that impact from within. From the international level, what you see are like the most key points, levers to use for countries to keep each other accountable and for the implementation of the frameworks that we all contributed to.
I mean, countries still have nukes, right? Including this one. So there is like some power over each other. So yeah, using pressure for getting kind of transparency about what's going on, and also helping with slowdown. Like both Dario and Demis last month at Davos called for slowdown, but like at the company level, you just can't do it because there's such a cutthroat competition with each other. So it needs to be like intervention, and I'm afraid that the intervention might actually have to come from like third countries because the countries hosting, they're just like so conflicted about the situation.
So I think it's really important to focus on the gap. I love this question. And to identify it and press on it. So, I mean, one of the, we were, I think some of us in this room around this same time last year were in Paris for the AI summit there. And, there were civil society folks brought into the planning of that, which was commendable. But I think the conversation that took place at that summit was not about welfare for all or happiness of all or inclusion, So I do commend the framing of this summit for bringing those issues about trust and about safety and guardrails and well-being sort of back to the table of these conversations. But there's going to be a gap, and we've got to press and identify the gap, just like shine a light on it. And I think ask, countries to sort of meet, this is what you've promised. I mean, I think this way often about bylaws and charters of organizations that are old. It's like, this is what we say we do or we believe in, and how do we do that? So that's just a philosophical thing. But I think, what we've been seeing in the United States with regards to AI policy, which is being called light touch or deregulatory, are a whole suite of levers that countries are using or can use to form alliances or to put pressure on others. Export controls on semiconductor chips, immigration policy, trade policy, tariffs, and these sorts of things. So these are levers that the United States has been using, sometimes as a bludgeon on other countries. But I mean, I think it opens up a different field of play for how we think about what levers are for AI policy, amongst countries and between countries. So we might consider some of that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to see if we can get a couple of people maybe in the middle or in the back. And I want to encourage all of you that have questions to visit with our panelists after the panel is over as well.
Hi. So the panel focused on democratic values throughout the session. What I'm worried about, and this plays to the fact that there are, the research on these frontier models, as mentioned, are hidden in labs and like they're not brought out to the public. So for for countries or organizations that don't respect these democratic values as much, what do we do then? And does that then mean that the countries that do value these democratic values are then forced into playing this game because the strategic and military advantages are way too much for us to ignore them? So how do you then play those? And especially because it's so secretive, like everyone's so secretive about the models and about how much progress is being made. So if it's not public information, how do you control it? We're talking about gaps, but how do you identify the gap if it's not public?
I can get us started, and I think everyone else in the panel probably has opinions on this as well. We talked a bit about transparency in these models, and the thing I worry about is what do we then do with this information, right? So even if all of the frontier labs came out today and said like these are all the things we're doing, what power and agency does anybody in this room have to do anything about that? These are massively, basically hegemonic powers at this point that can unilaterally act with extreme prejudice. So that is something that I do find concerning. Now, Alondra talked a bit about hard R regulation. We've been talking a little bit about soft R regulation. Like, what are the soft power mechanisms? And it is fascinating as a political scientist to see technology basically fall into the world of geopolitics and negotiation. And there are multiple different levers and bodies that are engaged in this. But to your point, and again, to Paul and Alondra's point about this race to the bottom, right? How can we aspirationally have government represent the best of the best and not really fall victim to this race to the bottom? The other thing is maybe from a purely capitalistic perspective. It has been interesting to me, and my corporation as well is set up as a public benefit corporation, and that presumably holds meaning. TBD, I was also at Twitter, which was not a public benefit corporation, and if you are familiar with the saga of Twitter, it is pretty much that it was in general agreement by the board that Elon Musk was not the right person, that people knew what was going to happen if he took over Twitter, but they had the fiduciary responsibility to sell to him. So, I have less, I am interested in the fact that Anthropic is set up as a public benefit corporation. I think it's an interesting experiment. I don't know if this is how I want to be experimented on, but I do find it interesting that there are new modalities of for-profit corporations being explored as well that may be able to answer your question. I too am now going to be a little bit Pollyannish about it because maybe we do need to be on this panel.
Maybe I'll just quickly add that I think one thing that came to mind is the role that economic competition will play. So I do acknowledge that there will, of course, be bad actors. But economic competition means that most companies, regardless of the country that they are within, will want to deploy within our other jurisdictions. And so for me, one key question comes back to something like technical standards and what role can they play when we think about things like benchmarks. If we're thinking about defining what good looks like and ensuring that we have a means through which we can hold companies accountable against that technical standard across countries, if we think about the standards at places like ISO, that provides us a means to kind of drive accountability across countries in a way that is interoperable and agreed. And there's an incentive there, because whether I'm a company from the US or the UK, I'm sort of thinking, I want to deploy in the EU, I want to deploy in Japan, and so that might be the incentive, and that's, of course, separate from bad actors. So I think technical standards could play a role, but of course, I know that there's still a lot of work to be done when we think about metrology and benchmarking.
My question focuses on the initial comment that we can't switch state. And my question is, which state? Ruman finally talked down to hegemony. We still have the Article 109 of the UN Charter pending for a good 70 years. That's the root cause of hegemony. Just a short comment on AI. It's a double-faced, it's a schizophrenic, multi-personality disorder. On one hand, it's a mellifluous symphony. Music, if you put it in hands of India, and Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, if you put it into the hands of a hegemon under a monstrous regime, the Donroe Doctrine, it's a Frankenstein monster waiting to gobble up humanity as a whole. My question to Professor Alondra, who is more Indian than many of us here. Let me just compliment that. Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam is a concert of civilization that needs to break away from the clash of civilizations that Samuel Huntington unwittingly trapped us into. My point is that, could it be just a fleeting superficial conversation, or could we unite even a small group of us to call for Article 109 for the UN review to move away with the veto powers and the permanent seats in the UN Security Council, and Article 6 to do away with the repeat violators of UN Charter, namely the United States of America, which incidentally is not a state. It is a